At the end of the previous lecture, we had just applied this wall mesh to the length of our spline to create a long, unbroken wall. Alright, so if you don't want to use the default material for the mesh, you can use this material overrides property to assign a different material instead. And then by default, the mesh will be centered horizontally in the middle of the spline path. But you can use this center adjust property to add an offset, either in the X direction or the Y direction. And then this scale to width property will scale the assigned mesh so that it matches the width of the spline. And it will scale the mesh uniformly, meaning the same in all directions. So with this property set to true, the wall will be extremely large because its width is naturally very thin and my spline is very wide. So when it scales the wall's width to match the spline, it also scales the wall the same amount in the other two directions, making it very large. So if I want to set the scale of the mesh based on the spline, I can leave this property set to true and then click the Select All Control Points button, and then use the half width property to adjust the width of the spline. And the scale of the mesh will update accordingly. Okay, so now I'm going to select all segments again. And so that's how to scale the mesh based on the width of the spline, but you can also use this scale property to set the scale manually. And then this forward axis property is used to define which axis should be considered forward, as far as the orientation of the mesh is concerned. By default, this will be the x-axis, which orients the mesh like so. But if I were to, for example, change this to the y-axis, then the wall will flip on its side, like this. And now my wall is being used as a road instead. Setting this value to z, however, won't work. And then similarly, this up-axis property is used to set the upward orientation of the mesh. By default, this is set to z, but changing this to y will have a similar effect as setting the forward axis to y. And then you also have the option to disable the ability of the meshes on the spline to cast shadows. So this can be useful in situations where you need to save on performance costs. Okay, and then down here, you can set the collision presets that the meshes of the spline should use. This is the same as the collision presets property on static mesh actors. So you can set this to no collision, block all, overlap all, etc. Alright, so you also have the option of adding multiple meshes to a spline. So for example, I'm going to click this add button again. And for index 1, I'm going to set the mesh to wall underscore 400 by 400, which is twice as tall as the mesh for index 0. And now you can see that the wall is actually alternating back and forth between the two different meshes. Alright, so in addition to automatically positioning and rotating meshes, another thing that makes Splines so powerful is their ability, as we've seen, to automatically deform the landscape to match the path of the spline. This is done automatically by default, but if I wanted to change this behavior, I could click the Select All Segments button, and then in the Landscape Deformation category, I could set these raised terrain and lower terrain properties to false. And now the terrain no longer matches the height of the path. And if I want to deform the landscape manually to match the path, I can come over to the landscape panel and use one of these two buttons here. It gives you the option to deform the terrain only for spline segments and points that are currently selected, or for every spline segment and point in the level. But I'm just going to go back to the details panel and set the raise and lower terrain properties back to true. So now the bottom of the wall is as close to the ground as possible. Depending on the path and the shape of the bottom of the mesh, however, it might not be possible to perfectly conform the terrain at every spot. This mainly happens in places where there is a sudden change in the angle of the path. So for any remaining gaps, you would need to try reducing the steepness of the angle of the path in that location, or use tricks like placing small dirt, rock, or grass meshes to cover up the gaps. Okay, so also in the landscape deformation category is the layer name property. So when the terrain is raised or lowered in a spot, it can end up creating more surface area across the terrain. If you have a landscape material applied to the landscape, the editor needs to know which landscape material layer to use to paint this new surface area. If this layer name property is set to none, it will simply use the base layer, but you can specify a different layer to use instead. Okay, and then there are a few other properties that affect the automatic landscape deformation feature as well. And those are actually properties of the control points of the spline, not the segments. So I'm going to click on the Select All Control Points button now. Okay, so if you recall, the ramp tool in sculpt mode performs a similar task as this deform feature. And that tool had a side falloff property that affected how steep the automatically raised terrain on either side of the ramp was. And so control points on splines have the same property. So when this property is set to very low values, the sides of the raised terrain will be very steep. But larger values will result in wider falloffs and thus less steep sides. And this property also controls the falloff of the landscape material layer that gets added. So if you remember, a falloff in the context of materials is the distance over which a material fades away or blends into another. So this will control the distance that the newly painted layer, controlled by the layer name property, will blend into the existing layers. Okay, but if you want independent control of the falloff for just the material layer, you can use the layer width ratio property, which acts as a multiplier of the side falloff property, but only affects the material layer falloff. Okay, and then the side falloff property will affect both sides of the spline, but if you want the two sides to have different falloff amounts, you can use the left and right side falloff factor properties to control the physical terrain falloffs of each side independently. And you can use the left and right side layer falloff factor properties to control the material layer falloffs of each side independently. And then finally, the end falloff property is used to control the falloff at either end of the spline, as opposed to its sides. Alright, so those are all the properties that affect the deform landscape feature, but while we're in the landscape spline category, there's one last property we haven't covered here, which is the mesh vertical offset property. And as its name implies, this will simply add an offset along the z-axis to the mesh applied at that point. So if I enter a value of, say, 200 here, it will raise the mesh 200 centimeters. Or if I enter a value of negative 200, it will lower the mesh 200 centimeters. And then these two buttons at the top of the landscape spline category, move to current level and update spline mesh levels. These have to do with Unreal's world composition system. This system is currently in the process of being deprecated, and so I'm not going to cover it in this course. Instead, I'll be covering the world partition system later on in this section. Alright, and that will conclude the lecture on landscape splines.